Welcome to the Brigham Young University Family History Library webinar series. My name is Sean Firmage. I will be your host for this webinar. Before we start, feel free to participate in the polls down at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions during the presentation, please ask them on the right-hand side of the slideshow. There will be a question pod. As a reminder, our next webinar will be tomorrow, June 29th at 3 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. That will be with Catherine Grant, and it will be titled Getting Started with Web Indexing. Today we will be pleased to hear from James Tanner, who will be giving a presentation titled Understanding Immigration for Genealogists. James has a bachelor's in Spanish and a master's in linguistics from the University of Utah. He received a Juris Doctor degree in law from Arizona State University. He worked for 39 years as an Arizona trial attorney. He previously owned a retail computer business and an Apple Macintosh software company. James has over 35 years of experience in genealogical research and is a blogger for Genealogy Star and the blog Rejoice and Be Exceeding Glad. He served for 10 years as a missionary at the Mesa, Arizona Family Search Library and is currently serving at the BYU Family History Library. He is the co-author or author of over 25 books on genealogical research and has presented at expos and conferences around the U.S. and Canada. James has 7 children and 33 grandchildren. And we will go ahead and turn the time over to you, James.
Sure. There we go. Howdy, this is James Tanner. Glad to be here with another BYU Family History Library webinar, and remind everyone that these webinars are recorded and uploaded to our BYU Family History Library YouTube channel, and invite all of you to subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you can be notified of future webinars, that are posted, and also helps us have visibility with our online presence with Google. Thank you. We're going to talk today about understanding immigration for genealogists, and rather than focus entirely on the idea of where we go to get records, because that seems to be the theme song of most of the presentations, we're going to talk a little bit more about the background, particularly the immigration law here in the United States. So let's get into it and look at some history here. First of all, just sort of a clarification of terminology. Although these two words sound almost exactly the same in English, they are not. Immigration, which is IMM, the I part of it, is people coming into the country. So you immigrate into the United States. And emigration, which is the EM word, is people who leave the country. So if you emigrate, EM, you are leaving, and if you immigrate, you are arriving. And it's kind of simple to remember it, in versus exit. So you can tell if you're coming in or you're exiting. So it's I is in and E is out. Okay, well, anyway, that's really silly, but that kind of helps to get rid of some basic confusion that happens here. Okay, now we need some definitions, and there are quite a few terms that have to do with immigration that are peculiar to that area of the law and of our culture. First of all, immigration is the act of coming to live permanently in a country where you're not a citizen. This can get really complicated, obviously, and over the years, basically in America, in the part of the country that we now call the United States, has been ambivalent, to say the least, about the process of people coming to live permanently who are not citizens. From the very beginning, and we go back to the very earliest English settlers, and we could say the same thing about Spanish or French or Russian or any of the other possible immigrant populations in the United States at the very early years of exploration, that it was sort of a first come, first serve. Once you got here, you were the permanent citizens, and the rest of the people who showed up were the immigrants. And of course, you didn't want them because they were then going to compete with you for all the scarce resources that you had that stretched across this entire empty country, except for a lot of Native Americans who were already here and were the real citizens of the country, and they were not happy to see you either. And so this was kind of a complicated situation that we went through here in the United States. So, and a lot of other countries are now suffering the same types of problems. Now, from a genealogist standpoint, we understand that there is sometimes a difficulty of finding out who these people were who came, because they came for a lot of different reasons. And we, have this big statue standing in the New York Harbor that seems to tell us that a lot of people came here for altruistic reasons to escape oppression and for freedom and all that kind of stuff. No, well, we hate to turn the tables on that a little bit here today, but we have to recognize also that there were a substantial number of people who were sent here, and rather, I would say, against their will. And we have to take into account that we have a fairly sizable percentage of our population who arrived under less than ideal circumstances as slaves. And then we have a lot of people that we don't acknowledge who came across as what we euphemistically call transported citizens, who were people who were, for any number of reasons, minor infractions of the law to major crimes, and just simply because you might not agree with the people in power. And they were put on boats and shipped over here as transported people, many of whom had a criminal background from that strict legal sense. And then we have a surprising number of people who came here under less than free circumstances as what we call indentured servants. And those people contractually, we use that term rather loosely because it wasn't necessarily an agreement between two people making, with equal bargaining power. The indentured servants were often as close to slaves as it is possible to be. And using that term, indentured servant, did not change the nature of their indenture, their ability to do things. But these people came to America, and in many cases, they are the ones that are difficult to discover or to trace back to their countries of origin. Okay, so now we're talking about emigration, the act of permanently leaving your country to live somewhere else. You would hope that you would become a citizen of the new country. You may or may not want to do that. Many people came to the United States over the years who never did apply for or receive citizenship, and so doesn't follow that once you get to a country to live that you became a citizen. Next is a passport. Today, in today's world, we are in the United States are becoming more familiar with the passport, primarily for the reason that only a few years ago they decided that we needed to have passports to go to Canada and Mexico. And so those of us who lived in southern Arizona, like I did for many years, used to kind of routinely take trips down to Nogales and to the other parts of Mexico. Nowadays, that doesn't happen quite so easily, and it's not quite so attractive because you have to have a passport, and you have to go through customs and all that sort of thing, both ways. You have to get into the country and have a visa, and you have to get back into the country and convince them that you're really a citizen and that you want to come back in. Okay. And a visa is a permit to enter a particular country for a specified period of time. It is also a credit card, but we ignore that part of this when we're talking about immigration. It is that technically can consist of a formal document, or it can be simply a stamp that's placed on a page of your passport that allows you to get entry. I can, from experience, I can tell you that getting into some countries is extremely difficult, and getting out is just as difficult. And other countries, recently we visited Costa Rica, and by the time we carried our baggage, we were walking as quickly as we could. They had stamped all the papers, and we were through. They didn't even bother to look at us. So, some countries just basically don't have the same problem. Coming back into the United States is a little bit different. situation today. And so we didn't quite go quite so fast when we came back in. Some further definitions here. An alien is not someone who comes in a spaceship, but a person who is not a citizen of the United States. And that's who we classified as aliens. And we have a terminology that we used to call them illegal aliens down in Arizona, and now that has been politically corrected to undocumented aliens. But they're still illegal, but that's beyond the point. An immigrant is a person who's been granted permission to live permanently in the country. You can live in a country your entire life and not be considered to be an immigrant because you never fulfill all the requirements of whatever country you come to qualify for citizenship. So that's part of that. A non-immigrant is a person who's been given permission to reside temporarily in a country. In the United States, we have historically had something that we call the green card, and a green card was a card given to primarily Mexican nationals who came to the United States for temporary employment. And we had tens of thousands of these people who would cross the border every year to assist with our agricultural harvesting and all of the other things that happened in the United States. That particular project has changed considerably with the huge influx of the undocumented people who live in the United States. So an illegal or undocumented alien is a person who has overstayed his or her visa or never had one, walked into the country without any permission from the country. Okay, we're going to keep going through definitions. I mean, this is the whole nature of the thing when you learn about it. If you don't learn all this language, you really don't know anything about naturalization. So naturalization admits a person or of a non-citizen to citizenship of a country. I'm in the process of doing another webinar, which we will present in July. So you can watch for that in the future on naturalization specifically. And you'll find out that the reason why I didn't include it in this one is because there's just this unending list of laws. They love to change the naturalization laws about every couple of years. And so the U.S. Congress has modified and changed who can come in, who can't come in, who can become a citizen, who can't become a citizen, almost consistently every few years since the United States began in 1782 or 3, when about the time of the Constitution. A foreign national is a person without U.S. citizenship or nationality. So we refer to these people as foreign nationals. Actually, we could call the same people who are illegal aliens, we could be more polite and call them foreign nationals, but then we would have some degree of legitimacy to who they are, so of course we don't do that. So we have to use a different term. A permanent resident is a person given permission to permanently reside in the United States, but is still not a citizen. At one time in my legal career, I decided that it would be interesting, since I spoke Spanish fluently and since I was very much acquainted with a large number of people in the Spanish-speaking community, to start practicing law as in the immigration law. People who advertise out there that they will help you with your immigration problems coming into the United States. Well, after studying the concepts, going through the books, I had a friend who said, here's all the books, read them. So I took all the books and I read them, and then I came back and talked to him. And he said, let me tell you the real reality of this. He said, every morning, as he was an immigration lawyer, and he said, every morning I get on the computer and I look to see what the law has changed today. Literally, he said, they set daily quotas for the number of people who can enter from each country. So that changes like the stock market. I mean, you watch it every hour, every day. It changes how many people can come in, who they're letting in today. Somebody starts a war someplace, it all changes that day. If somebody shoots somebody, it changes. Whatever happens, changes the numbers. And I said, no, I can't live with that. I'll go do something else, like land and property, like stuff that never change. Oh, well, yeah, but it does change, but not quite as volatilarily as immigration law. A refugee, now here's a little bit more complicated. A refugee is a person outside of his or her country of nationality who is unable or unwilling to return to that country because of persecution or fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. My ancestors were refugees, by the way. They left the United States of America because of religious persecution and went to Mexico. And I have relatives who left the United States after it became part of where they lived became part of the United States. They still left the United States and went to Mexico. So we just have a group of people who, for whatever reason, are not welcome in the country where they were originally living, and now have to live someplace else. And if we read the news today, we know that this is a major, major issue. Well, for genealogists, it's another major issue, because if your ancestor was a refugee, they probably didn't bring a lot with them. They probably didn't come with all their papers and all their history and all their culture and everything else. They just came with their clothes on their back and walked out of their country, or probably got chased out or whatever. And so how do we find these people? Well, these are some of the questions that arise as a result of this immigration issue, and particularly in the area that we're interested in finding our ancestors and determining which of our people came in various categories here. Now, we are literally a country of immigrants, and even the people who are termed in our terminology Native Americans are immigrants. They basically came into this country sometime in the past. Their ancestors got here before my ancestors, so they have more valid claim than my ancestors do. But my ancestors got here before your ancestors, and so I have a better claim than you have. Okay, so we can get going into that if we like. And it's a lot to say about that. So what's a United States citizen? Today, if you want to be a United States citizen, what do you have to do? Number one, it's an individual who was born in the United States. Now, this did not actually occur instantaneously, by the way. We have a wonderful thing out there called the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, and basically it said that a person who was native born in the United States became a citizen, and that didn't happen until the 1860s, actually 1868. And so basically, these are the people who, before that time, there were a large number of people within the United States, primarily those who had been formerly slaves, who were not considered to be citizens. Okay, and we had the 14th Amendment, and it said everyone who was native born in the United States is a citizen of the United States. And you read that thing, and it doesn't say anything about except there was an except Native Americans. Indians were not considered citizens until the 1920s. Until basically, they couldn't vote. And so you really have to look at this law and all of the history of this in order to understand what happened to your ancestors. If your ancestors were black or Native American, or if they were Chinese, or if they were Japanese, or if they were Polish, or if they were Scottish, or if they were Irish, or if they were anything, practically speaking, at some point in the country, there was a law restricting what they could do and what they couldn't do. And so we need to be aware of that as we're doing our research, because a lot of the unanswered questions are really questions of understanding what the legal status was of the person when they got to the United States. What chance did they have to become a citizen, if at all? And for many, many years, as racially tinted as it may sound, the law in the United States is that you could not become a citizen of the United States unless you were a free white person, male, and came to the United States. And the definition of white was basically up to whoever was in charge. Okay, so an individual whose parent is a U.S. citizen. Now, this is a strange thing because uh, one of my daughters was born in a foreign country. She was born in the Canal Zone in Panama. And she had to apply for, when she was born, she had to apply for and become a United States citizen. And so we had to go through that naturalization process with her as a citizen to become a citizen of the United States. Even though her parents were citizen, we were both citizens. Because she was not born in the United States, she had to be naturalized. So she has naturalization papers. So this is an interesting kind of way that things work. And if a person goes through the process, if they're an alien who's been naturalized, and we have the naturalization law, and I mentioned I'm going to be talking about that in more detail in a future webinar, but the naturalization process is pretty complex and changes, like I said, from almost every couple of years that changes. So if an individual is born in Puerto Rico, Guam, or the United States Virgin Islands, they are also considered to be citizens of the United States. Most recently, of course, we have more news going around that Puerto Rico may be demanding to become a state or trying to become a state, a 51st state of the United States, and you know, I guess you could probably have some political views on that subject. So now we're talking about the history of immigration in the United States. So how did it all happen that we all got here? Of course, we know the old story about Columbus sailing the ocean blue in 1492, but not too many of us in the United States trace our ancestry back to the early Spanish conquistadores. They may have generations past been partially or mixed with the Spanish Empire, but for the large part, we have a large history of people who were already here. So we didn't have anybody in the United States. Of course, the United States started pretty late, in the late 1700s, before we got around to having the United States of America. And by that time, there were already millions of people here on the continent, and they all became, and according to the Constitution of the United States, and according to the laws set by Congress, only a small portion of those people automatically became citizens of the United States, and even a smaller portion of those people were allowed to vote. So we have, we have come through a lot of very, very serious conflicts and problems across our country. Based on the definition of who and who is not a citizen of the country. So here's an interesting list. This is a list of the ancestry groups. For what they're worth, they're kind of vague, just kind of like the DNA tests that we're getting today. They're very vague. If they say you're from Western Europe, what does that mean? I don't know. But this is a list of the largest groups. The number one group of people in the United States are descended from Germans. Germans are the number one largest group of immigrants that have come to our country. So people from the central, north central area of Europe that now we call Germany, but used to be called Poland, that is still now called Poland, and part of which is into Russia and the Balkans and into Southern Europe and all that anyway. But all those people were called Germans if they spoke some kind of German language. And they are the ones that are number one immigrants. The second group were African Americans, and for the most part, they were brought here involuntarily. They didn't, they didn't have to pay passage. They got free ride over here, but they didn't really want that. And so they are, but they make up the second largest group of immigrants in the United States. And third is Irish. Part of the reason, the political part of it was social, and part of that was just plain starving to death. Back in the mid-1800s, they had a thing called the Irish potato famine, and as a result, millions of Irish people were starving to death, and they packed up and came to America. And so we have a huge influx of Irish. And you start down through the list, Mexican. English, by the way, is way down there. So why do we speak English? Who knows? But anyway, we do. And we should be speaking either German or Spanish, but we don't. We speak English, so everyone was learning English. We can say the English were here first, but they weren't. The Spanish were here long before the English ever got here to the United States. By 1620, the Spanish had been in Latin America for almost 100 years. So, it's interesting. We do, and the United States is rapidly, by the way, becoming, at least in my part of the world, in Arizona and California and those kinds of places, if you aren't bilingual and you don't have your signs in both English and Spanish, if you don't have somebody working for you who speaks Spanish, you don't do any business, because clearly half the people walking in, or more than half of the people, are going to be Spanish-speaking people. So we're basically a bilingual country. Canada did it formally by having French and English as their national languages, and well, I don't know. I can probably foresee the day where we may have Spanish and English as our national languages, but we'll see if that ever happens. Italians, Polish, French, Scottish, Scotch-Irish, Dutch, Puerto Ricans, and the whole list goes on and on. This is in kind of order of the percentage of people who are descendants. So you are very likely, as a genealogist, to find out you have German ancestors, because that's the largest immigrant group. Your next group is black African Americans, black people, and then Irish, and then so forth. So these are the ones that you will deal with. Now, my experience as genealogist is exactly this. This is what I find. I find the highest percentage of people that I deal with come from this first 4 or 5 people list on the 4 or 5 groups on this list. So this is who we're going to have to deal with. Now we're looking at the size of the immigrant population. This will just give you an idea of what's happened in the last few years. Why is this important to genealogists? Well, because this is us, and we're going to be doing our genealogy, and so we'll need to know how many of us are actually descendants from immigrants. And if you see there, the immigrant population and the percentage of the total U.S. population just back in 1970, that doesn't seem too long ago for those of us who are getting elderly. But it was only about 4.7% of the United States, and there were about 9.6 million. Today, well, 2015, it's probably gone up a couple of since then, but we're looking at almost 13.5% of our population are recent, 100%, meaning these are people who were born in other countries, immigrants. And we're looking at about 43.3 million people in our country who were born in someplace else besides the United States. So we have a lot of people. I just started working the other day, just yesterday, by the way, with a friend of mine who wanted some help with his genealogical research. And my surprise was, I mean, I would never have guessed, but my surprise was that he was the immigrant. He was from Germany. Switzerland, his ancestors were in Germany, and they moved to Switzerland, and then he came to America. So he left Switzerland right before World War II. He was 1 year old and got to the United States. And I would never have known that he was an immigrant. Well, he said, had he not gotten out of Switzerland when he did, right before the war, he probably would have been speaking German when he got here. So this is an interesting thing. Okay, so now we're going to go back to colonial times so we can understand this. Now, if you're doing your research and you're going back in time, chances are very good that you will, within the first 4 or 5 generations of your research, sometimes your first generation, but going back 4 or 5 generations, you're going to begin to see immigrants. You're going to see people who were born in England or Italy or Spain or someplace else besides the United States. So we have to know how this happened. And the first immigrants to America, the first people to come here from Europe, were the Spanish, and they settled in the Southwest and in Florida, as far as we're talking about the boundaries of the United States of America. And so we have Spanish influence in the Southwest and in Florida that goes back into the 1500s. And long before, as I mentioned previously, long before the English or any of the other groups of people came who were established here. The French started out in the north part of what we have now, the United States, and in Canada, what now is called Canada. And so they were a very big presence in the early times. The British came along the eastern coast of what we now have as the United States, the eastern coast of America, from the northern part that we call New England for very obvious reasons, and then down into the south, all the way down to what we now call Georgia. And interestingly enough, of course, when the British and the English and the French and the British and the Spanish and the French people all got together, they decided to fight each other. So it was kind of a carryover from Europe because they've been fighting for hundreds of years over in Europe. So they just brought the wars to America. So now we have a whole series of wars between all of these people that happened here on the American continent. And back in those early days, from the 1500s to the 1700s, immigration policy was controlled by the country who claimed sovereignty. Well, let me tell you basically what it was in the time of the British rule. First of all, you have to understand this very clearly. This is something that most people, for some reason, it escapes them, and it seems like it's just an obvious fact, but it's not something people think about. When someone got on a ship in colonial times and left England and came to America, they were in the same country. They were not immigrants, by definition. So we can't talk of British immigrants to America because there weren't any until after the Revolutionary War and until we had the United States of America. All these people who showed up in New England they're living in the same country. They didn't have to go anywhere. They didn't need passports. They didn't need visas. They didn't need anything. They just bought passage on a ship and walked off the ship. So we're not going to find a whole lot of immigration records in this early time period. You know, if you lived in Spain and you got on a ship and came to Mexico before 1830, you were basically in Spain. So you didn't have to do anything. You know, there was no entry or exit or anything. Now, we're going to talk about what happened during that period of time. We have a period of time that we call the Great Migration. Now, we have to qualify this because there are 2 or 3 episodes of our history in the United States that we call the Great Migration. One of the Great Migrations that we refer to are the former slaves living in the South who moved northward after the Civil War. And we call that the Great Migration. But this is the original Great Migration that happened from 1620 to 1640. And during that period of time, we had the Puritan Pilgrims. These people when they got here, were called Congregationalists, and they came for a lot of different reasons, but to some extent it was based on their religious beliefs. And there were about 20,000 people who migrated in this early period of time from 1620 to 1640 from England to the United States, America. Now, how many of the people in the United States are descended from these 20,000 plus people? Well, yeah, lots and lots of people. You know, they estimate, for example, that 10% of the population of the United States have ancestors that came across in the 50 or so people who were on the Mayflower. So of the 20,000 people, you can imagine there's lots and lots of people who have ancestral lines that go back into New England. And these people were mostly educated, middle-class people who came here for their own reasons. Now, as you start down the coast, that's New England. And if you start on down the coast, then the demographics of the people change dramatically. As you get down into Virginia and North Carolina and South Carolina and Georgia and all of the eastern seaboard coast down there, the type of people who came across changed dramatically. If you want to read about this, by the way, there's a book out there called Albion Seed. You can look it up online. It's ALBIONS apostrophe S, Seed. And it's the history of the 5 different social, cultural, economic groups that came out of England Albion is the historical name of the British island. And so they were the people who came from Great Britain and began this process. Actually, back in the 1600s, it wasn't Great Britain because Great Britain didn't occur until the 1700s, but it was England, Scotland, and Wales. Okay, the new nation, the United States of America, 1790 to 1820. And we've got census returns, and there were, in that period of time, back in the 1790 census and a few censuses later, there were 3.9 million people counted, and the English were the largest ethnic group, and 20% were of African heritage. German, Scottish, and Irish residents were also well represented. So you had, these are the primary groups that came and started what we now have as the United States. And they're the historical ones, and that's why they have the largest group of people today, is because they go back in history. So you probably have a fairly good chance if you do your genealogy back and your people who came into the United States early on, back here in the 16 or early 1700s, that your ancestors will end up being English, or they'll end up being Africans, or they'll end up being German, Scottish, or Irish. These are the ones you'll end up having as ancestors. You don't need a DNA test, by the way, to know this. You just need to do a little bit of genealogical research, and you can figure out who these people are. Okay, so now you have the big migration, and I am guessing that this old engraving here, illustration, is kind of an understatement of what really happened. I mean, there really were these mobs of people coming in, and they really were just pouring in with almost nothing but the clothes on their back. And they migrated between 1815 and 1865. And during that time period, they came from Northern and Western Europe. So we were getting a lot of Northern Germany, Danish, Swedish, Norwegian people, and Western European people of all different classes, from the Netherlands and from France and all of their places in Europe. During this time period, and within a few years later than 1865, I have two lines that came from Denmark, and they came to America during this particular period. So this is consistent with a lot of the things you might find in your own thing. And by the way, about a third of all these people who came during that 1815 to 1865 were the ones who came from Ireland. So you're going to find a lot of Irish ancestors. And of course, if you know a little bit about genealogical research, you'll start to wring your hands about the time you figure out your ancestors came from Ireland, because unless you're extremely well placed and lucky, you probably will have an uphill battle finding out where these people came from. Ireland, and I did a webinar not too long ago on Ireland, Irish history, and Ireland genealogy, and basically they just fought with each other from prehistoric times to the present, and they didn't, we talk about courthouses burning in the United States. Well, they just burned everything all the time. It was just a constant battle of war that went on between the British, between English and the Irish and the settlers and all of that sort of thing, and that was just a constant battle. And so we really have a significantly large number of Irish immigrants, and this is a set of statues that's over in Ireland, and they showing the condition of the Irish immigrants, because they were literally starving to death. They had been pushed off of their farms. The potato famine had potato blight. They primarily were subsisting on potatoes as their food crop. And the potatoes all died, and they did too. And during that period of time, millions of people perished from hunger. And then they were, as quickly as they could gather anything together, would come to America. So when they got off the boat, they were basically as they looked like this. In a lot of cases, they were very, very poor people. And they were very discriminated against, and they had a lot of trouble establishing themselves. This is the Famine Memorial in Dublin. This is what they, kind of an understated memorial, but it kind of shows exactly what was going on during that period of time. And about 33 million Americans, 10% of the total population, reported Irish ancestry in the 2013 U.S. Census to the U.S. Census Bureau. So we have that's probably based on a survey, but that's about it. So about 10% of the United States, 1 out of every 10 people is of Irish ancestry. So then what happened? Well, that was just the bare beginnings, because once they got the idea that coming to America was a good thing, and leaving all of that, the problems they had in Europe, we started the big migration. And that I don't know why they called the 1620 to 1640 thing the Great Migration, because this is the Great Migration. This is the Immigration Deluge, and that is from 1880 to 1930. We had 27 million people come to the United States. Okay, so we're looking at probably a significantly large increase in the population of the country based solely upon the number of immigrants who were coming in every year. And so everyone, in this case, if your ancestors came in during this time period from 1880 to 1930, you're basically got a pretty easy road to determining them, because they either came through one of two places. The greatest number of population of these people, more than half, came through two places. They either came through Ellis Island or through the other port in I'll get that in a second. Just went out of my head. I'm sorry. It'll come back. Castle Garden or Ellis Island, the two ports. Then in 1930, the United States suddenly went absolutely anti-immigrant, partially caused, of course, by World War I, and also caused by the imminent changes that were happening. The big thing there was of course, was the Great Depression, which began in the early 1930s, and it was not fun. It was a very, very difficult, very severe time in the United States, and it was not healthy for people trying to come here from a foreign country, because you were just going to be competing with our people, whoever was already here, for jobs, and the jobs were scarce, and the people were literally starving. And it was not a time when we were going to be accommodating to having a whole bunch more people show up in the United States. So that began the process of closing. Now, interesting thing, here's an interesting fact. The United States had no immigration laws until the 1882. So before 1882, we didn't have any control over immigration in the United States. Anybody who walked across the border, who landed in a ship, could come into the country. We didn't care. And it was only in the 1880s they began, and the only people they were concerned about then, back in the 1880s, were Chinese. And so they passed a series of laws called the Chinese Exclusion Acts. And those Chinese Exclusion Acts, those were the first limitations on any immigration to the United States. So between 1880 and 1930 is when they started to pass laws, when they became, the people who were here started to become alarmed because they couldn't, because of the numbers of people who were coming into the country. So you're going to find these things. In other words, depending on who you find out that your ancestors were, or where they came from, you need to know how the policies of how they got here. If you're going to trace these people back across the ocean to their countries of origin, you have to understand all this stuff. You have to know how did they get here? What was the status of the law when they arrived? Were they pilgrims and got here in 1620 and landed in the wrong place and spent a year trying to figure out where they'd landed and who owned the land and how they could own anything? Or were they people who came just before the Great Depression, back in the 1920s and the early 1930s, when the doors were closing, and they made it in the United States literally by the skin of their teeth, because they had no way to get in after that. And my friend that I mentioned, who I said was a new recent immigrant from Germany, one of the stories we want to try to confirm or deny is that he has been told that his family were on the last boat allowed to come across the Atlantic before the last civilian passenger ship to come across the Atlantic before the World War II started. So they were the last group to come in, and we'll figure that out. That's something I know the name of the ship, so we'll probably figure that one out. Okay, this is Castle Garden, and Castle Garden was down on the end or tip of New York and of Manhattan Island, excuse me, and there at the end of Manhattan Island, they built this immigration center called Castle Garden. It was open from 1820 to 1892 for quite a long period of time. So this is one of the major entry points. You have to understand, however, that there were lots of seaports in the United States. It didn't take a seaport. You could come in through, and as some of my ancestors, by the way, which I traced back, who came from Ireland, entered the United States from Canada because they landed and stayed in Canada in New Brunswick. And then they got on a boat and they didn't come to Castle Garden or New York or Baltimore or Philadelphia. They came to Passamaquoddy, Maine. And they got off the boat. And then they got on a train and came down the coast to Philadelphia. So, you really have to kind of look around a little bit. I probably said that name wrong, so if you're from Maine, please excuse me. But anyway, it's not as bad as where I'm from is Mesa, M-E-S-A, which, by the way, is commonly said is Mesa. When people ask us where we're from, they say, now, are you from Mesa, Arizona? And I go, yeah, Mesa. And they go, Mesa? Anyway, there were 11 million immigrants from 1820 to 1892 who came through Castle Garden. So you got a pretty good percentage of people you might have. There are websites, I'll show that in a minute, where you can find this information out. And what were the restrictions on immigration? The first one, 1880, you could walk across the border and land at a boat, whatever you wanted to do. Nobody cared if you came into the country. They didn't care what language you spoke. They didn't care what your religion was. They didn't care anything. You just came in. Nobody was asking you any questions. There weren't any border guards. There was nobody there that would stop you from coming across the border. Chinese Exclusion Act was 1882, and it also imposed an immigration head tax. So an immigrant had to pay a fee to get into the country. So they had to raise that in their country of origin before they could get here to the United States. And then we started a lot of what we called alien contract labor laws from 85 through 87. And these laws said, well, we're going to hire a bunch of people. Now, why were they doing this? Well, they're building railroads across the country, and they needed Irish people who needed jobs, and they needed Chinese workers who needed jobs. And these people would sign a contract and get paid some ridiculously small amount for their labor in building the railroads, and they could stay here because they built the railroads. Well, some of them managed to stay beyond that. In a lot of cases, we were talking about people who who did not end up staying in the United States. Then, in 1891, the United States government began to process and accept or reject the immigrants. So at that point in time, they began to decide, as this is in our history, this is like really recent. We're talking 1891. That's when my grandparents were born, and they were, in that time period. And so what we're talking about here is that this is when they first began to talk about who was going to be able to come into the country or not. So all this stuff we're talking about today, how picky we are about who comes in and who doesn't come in, just didn't even start until quite late in our history. So Ellis Island, they built Ellis Island. Actually, the real estate on Manhattan got to be too expensive to support a immigration facility. I mean, if you really want to know the basis for why all this happened, they got cheap land out here on Ellis Island, which, by the way, was mainly just fill dirt from all the stuff they dug. out of the out of Manhattan and out of Newark and all the other places around there. And so now they built up this island, and they built a kind of an old, very romantic looking building. By the way, this is the building. It's still there. It's a really interesting place to visit. So if you ever go to New York, you got to get on the boat and go out to Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty. That's mandatory almost. And about 51 plus million passenger records came through Ellis Island, and they have a database online of all these people. One of the most common things you'll hear about, oh, they changed my ancestor's name when they came to America. No, they didn't. They never did. The people changed their names before they even left. They didn't tell the name when they had to tell the name, but they immediately changed their name when they got into the country. Some of these names, everybody here in the United States was speaking English, except the little ethnic groups. But if you wanted to do anything in the country, you recognized rather quickly you had to learn to speak English. If your name was, say, in Finnish or in Polish or in Hungarian or something, you'd change it real quick because nobody could spell it, nobody could understand what you were saying, and you might as well change your name, which is what happened a lot of times. And that thereby comes one of the great challenges of genealogical research, is tracking these people back to their country of origin and determining what their name was before they got here. So we're into that situation. Every wave of immigrants has always resisted and persecuted the next wave, and I kind of said that too much already, so I won't go into it. This cartoon kind of says it all. The immigrant's the guy in the middle. The people that are here are the ones that are eating them up and trying to eat them all up. So we don't have anything that even vaguely approximates any of these old 1800s political cartoons today. That would be so bad. Nobody would ever do that anymore. They were really bad. Okay, so we have the U.S. Immigration Service. Understanding this is important because you need to know where the records are. This is where you go to find your ancestors' immigration records, if they're within these time periods. If they're before that, you've got different challenges. If it's back before they passed any immigration laws, then you've got to look to see if there are what are called border crossing records, because some of the ports of entry kept border crossing records. You also have passenger lists if they came over in boats, and you have other ways of finding the immigrants. But basically, by the end of the 1800s, by the beginning of the 1900s, the United States government had taken over the process of recording who was coming in and who was going out. Okay, so in 1891, we have the Immigration Superintendent of Immigration created in the Treasury Department. By 1895, the Superintendent of Immigration was upgraded to the Bureau of Immigration. So now we have the Bureau of Immigration. In 1903, the Bureau of Immigration was transferred to the Department of Commerce and Labor. So we see the United States was growing. The government was becoming more bureaucratic, bigger, more agencies and all sorts of things. And the immigration records began to move from all these departments. So you really kind of have to understand this history of the transfer of these records to understand where your records are going to end up being about where these people. By the way, all these go into the National Archives. So basically everything that you're going to look here is going to end up in the National Archives, but it's going to be cataloged under these different departments. So you may have to be looking in different places to find records. And by 1906, the Naturalization Service was created, and the Bureau of Immigration became the Bureau of Immigration and Naturalization, which is what it was for most of my life. That's what we had heard. And so the U.S. Immigration Service, 1913, became the Bureau of Immigration and the Bureau of Naturalization, and it was now in the Department of Labor. And then we had the Border Patrol created in 1924. So we didn't even have a Border Patrol. We weren't going to build walls on the Mexican border then. We didn't even have anybody patrolling the borders. They could care less what was coming across, but now we do. And so we have a lot of problems there. So now we have the Border Patrol within the Bureau of Immigration. In 1933, the Bureau of Immigration and the Bureau of Naturalization became the INS, the the Immigration Naturalization Service, or INS. And that's what, when we lived in Arizona, of course, you always heard about the Immigration and Naturalization, the INS. So that was the big deal. And in 1940, the INS transferred from the Department of Labor to the Department of Justice. In other words, okay, now think about this. They moved it from the Labor Department, which was focusing on production and labor and industry, and they put it over into what? The Department of Justice. In other words, this is when they began to criminalize the whole concept of immigration. The idea that not only were you an illegal alien, but that was somehow a breach of some law that you'd violated simply by coming into our country. And this is really, I mean, this is within the lifetime of a lot of people. And so we're now getting into that situation. And it wasn't even until 2003 that the INS was abolished, and it turned into a whole bunch of different stuff. The USCIS, the ICE, and the CBP, and they have the DHS. Okay, I got to do this. We're going to translate the acronyms here. INS is Immigration and Naturalization Service. UCIS is the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. The ICE is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. These are the guys on the border right now, by the way. They're the trucks that are looking for the aliens that are coming in. Down in southern Arizona, by the way, we have to go through these roadblocks constantly. Every place I go. Every time I go to Yuma, I have to go through a roadblock. They have to look at me and say, "You're good to go, man." And I get to drive through. They don't know I had 15 guys in my trunk, but that's they can pretty well tell. But then we have CBP, Customs and Border Protection, and now we have to understand that immigration research begins in the country of arrival. You don't go looking for your guys if they say they're from Ireland or Germany or whatever. You don't go to Germany or Ireland to start looking for them. You look right here in the United States, and you keep looking here until you find out exactly where these people came from, because you are not going to be able to find the right people if you don't find them here first. And where do I start? I start with the census records. They give you a country of origin. And beware, the designations are not accurate. They have no idea where these people came from, and they sometimes made it up just because what they sounded like. And we can look at their naturalization papers and come up with the ideas of where they came from. By the way, the old naturalization papers, if you scout them down, before 1906, they were all handled by state courts, and they didn't care. They don't put down the same thing that the census people did. Ireland, Germany, France, wherever. That doesn't help you. So sometimes naturalization, it's only after 1906, when the federal government took over, that they began to record more detail about where all these people came from. So before that, you're really kind of chancy you're going to get any information out of this. Passenger lists, sometimes they were very accurate and recorded exactly where these people came from, the towns. A lot of times they simply listed the port, so you may not get anything online. And by the way, the largest collections are on Ancestry.com. And church records are good because when they came from their church in Europe into the church in America, sometimes they had to bring a certificate of membership from their church in England or Germany or wherever to become an active member of their church in the United States. And they recorded that. So that's very helpful sometimes. Whereas some other things, border crossing records, immigration records in Europe, Mexican border crossings, passenger arrivals, and ship arrivals. These are all classifications of records that may or may not apply, but they're worth looking at if your people fit into any of these categories. Surprisingly, you may find out your people came from Canada. It was easier in a lot of time periods to come into Canada and stay there for a period of time before you came to the United States. So you'll find out that your ancestors who immigrated into the United States came to Wisconsin or to one of the states, North Dakota or someplace, and you can't understand how that happened, but that's how they got here. Okay, so we have Castle Garden is the website that I mentioned, castlegarden.org, and they have a database that you can look. Very helpful, very interesting. You can sometimes find. Be sure to use a lot of different variations on your ancestor's name, especially if they came from Eastern Europe or someplace like that. It's castlegarden.org. And then we have Ellis Island. It's called the Statue of Liberty Ellis Island Foundation, and they have a passenger search, and it's Liberty Ellis Island Foundation, ellisfoundation.org, libertyellisfoundation.org. And we can always look on the other major websites. They all have passenger lists and immigration records of all different kinds. You can't assume that any one of these sites has all the records. You need to search all these sites. Find My Past is English primarily. My Heritage is supposedly sure does have a lot of records from Europe, but primarily is probably the largest collection of German records. Family Search has a little bit of everything, and Ancestry, of course, does also. So keep searching, keep finding. It's a task. I don't want to discourage anybody, but I spent 15 years trying to find where my Irish great-great-grandfather was born, and it turned out that I found it on a record here in the United States when he got married. So it took me a long time to find that record, but I did. So you might be surprised where you find the information. Could be any place. And thanks for watching, and remind everyone that these webinars are recorded and uploaded to our BYU Family History Library YouTube channel on youtube.com. So look for BYU Family History, and we'd be glad if you would subscribe. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, James. And thank you to everybody who joined us today. Like he said, we will have this uploaded to YouTube shortly. As a brief reminder, our next webinar is tomorrow, June 29th at 3 p.m., and that will be with Catherine Grant. So if you'd like to tune in for that one as well, you're more than welcome to. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. All right.